Hey everyone.
Hey guys.
Welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor video. Tonight we're going to be talking about inflation. This is a hot topic for everyone lately, and we've gotten a lot of questions recently about inflation, especially from travel therapists. I think as travelers we notice inflation a lot more than other people. We're going to talk a little bit about that and how that is going to impact future pay. So a lot of people want to know, since inflation's higher than usual, does that mean that pay packages are going to increase along with inflation? And so we want to give a little insight into that. It's probably not what you think. Inflation is it's detrimental to everyone, but I think it's particularly detrimental to healthcare workers because of fixed reimbursement rates. So I'm going to get this video shared in a few different groups, and Whitney's going to introduce us.
All right. Hey everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Whitney Aiken.
And I'm Jared Cazazzo.
And we're both traveling doctors of physical therapy. Many of you guys may know us as the faces behind Travel Therapy Mentor. I know a lot of you guys have watched our videos or listened to our podcasts in the past. So thank you for those of you guys that have watched before. If you're brand new to our page, then welcome. We've been doing these videos for several years now. We've been travelers for 7 years ourselves, and we started doing videos consistently, I'd say 3 or 4 years ago. We've talked about a lot of different topics. Lately, we haven't been as consistent with our videos because we're on a travel contract in Alaska. So sorry about that. We haven't had as much time to get the videos done, and then also the time difference makes it really hard because we're 4 hours ahead of Eastern time. So we're pretty close to Pacific time, but it makes it harder for those of you guys that are in Central or East Coast. So thanks again for tuning in for tonight. I know a lot of you guys will watch live. If you are watching live, we'd love if you'd say hello in the comments and let us know that you're watching live. If you decide to watch later on the Facebook replay, you can type replay or just say hey in the comments. And I know as well a lot of you guys will listen later when we do upload it to our podcast. So thanks for those of you that are listening on our podcast. Some people recently asked us if there was some way that they could support us because they like to listen to our videos on our podcasts a lot and they've learned a lot from us. If you do listen on the podcast, we'd love if you would leave a review on whichever podcast platform you listen to. A lot of people leave reviews on Apple Podcasts. We would really appreciate that, and it would definitely help us out. If you do listen a lot or tune in to us on Facebook, you can also leave us a review on our Facebook business page for Travel Therapy Mentor. We definitely appreciate you guys' support. So as Jared said, he's sharing our video in a couple of groups just so that more of you guys can tune in with us live tonight. It's funny saying tonight because it's broad daylight outside here. It's 5 o'clock in Alaska, but it stays light until after midnight right now, which is pretty interesting. Many of you guys may have been following along with our Alaska adventures on Instagram. It's been just an amazing time. We've already been here a month and we've just really been enjoying it. If you ever get a chance to take a contract in Alaska, we would highly recommend it. So I just want to say hey to a few people that are listening live as we're getting started here. Hi Armin, hi Gretchen, hi Jack Rudy, hey Megan, hey Jennifer, hey Melissa, hi Joel, hey Brittany, hi Joey. Thank you guys for tuning in live. We appreciate it. Let us know if you are watching live in the comments. Say whether you're like a current travel therapist, if you're someone who's thinking about getting into travel therapy, because we know inflation affects everybody in the country. So it's definitely affecting those of us that are already traveling. And I know a lot of you guys have probably seen that with housing costs, with the rise in gas prices affecting your travel from location to location, and potentially with your pay packages. And then there's a lot of you that aren't traveling yet that may be wondering if now is a good time to get into traveling and you're worried about the increased costs associated with travel therapy. And we definitely understand that. So we want to address some of those issues for you guys as it pertains to inflation, because it definitely affects all of us, but I think travel therapists more so. Hey Katie. Hi Josh. Josh says current travel therapist. Hi Harrison. Hi Peter. Hey Gretchen, current travel therapist. Melissa is looking into traveling for the fall. She's an OT. Welcome. Yeah, we've had a lot of people looking to get started this summer and into this fall. We're actually going to do a full job market update. We haven't done one recently. I think our last one was April. We're going to do a full job market update at the beginning of July to tell you guys about all the stats in terms of job numbers, pay rates, that kind of thing, and different trends that we're seeing. But we'll kind of hint at some of that stuff tonight too. All right, so Jared's just about done getting everything shared to the different groups, so more of you guys can tune in, and then we'll get started just kind of talking about the topic. So as he's finishing that up, I'll just kind of start with an overview. So inflation has been increasing over the last I don't know, what'd you say, Jared, like 6 months?
Yeah, it's been pretty much high over the last year. Much higher than normal.
Just the first 6 months of 2022 is when we've really all started to notice it a lot more.
Yeah, so the official numbers for the last year are around 8.5%. And I think probably anybody watching this, any travelers especially, realize that it's probably a lot higher than that. And I think, like I said, I think travelers recognize inflation rates quicker than other people do. And that's because we travel a lot more, we have duplicate housing, we probably eat out more than most permanent people do, people that aren't moving around, just because when you're traveling from location to location, it's more convenient. When you're settling in or leaving an assignment, it's more convenient. So I think we see those costs a little bit more.
And we're seeing different parts of the country. So somebody who lives in the same place may have like relatively fixed expenses, but we're getting a lot of experiences in different states and different cities. So we could see a lot more of that change.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of other people don't realize about inflation is that a major factor in inflation, in the inflation calculation, the CPI, is housing costs. But it's not measured the way that you think it would be. You would think, okay, housing costs would be measured based on home sales prices or rent prices or a combination of the two, because that's what people actually pay. But in reality, the CPI, the housing component of it, which is 1/3 of the total CPI, is based on what's called owner's equivalent rent. And essentially, they just reach out to homeowners and they ask them, how much do you think you could rent your house for? And they think that this is a pretty good estimation of inflation and housing prices. Unfortunately, over the last year, it has not been a good measure of inflation for housing prices, because if you look at the numbers, it indicates that housing is only up about 5.5% over the last year. If you ask anyone, I don't think there's anywhere in the country where housing is only up 5.5%. It's realistically probably most places 15 to 20%. You guys watching, what is it in your area? Well, how much do you think housing has gone up in the last year or 2 years?
And that includes both renting and sales prices. I mean, we all know that if you've looked at buying a house or selling a house, the prices are outrageous. But even with rentals, long-term and short-term rentals have gone up as well.
Yeah, and we started noticing this back in 2021. As travelers, short-term housing prices started shooting up. Even at the end of 2020, they started going up quite a bit. And it was all blamed on COVID back then, and maybe some landlords aren't renting as much as they normally would because they were fearful of COVID. But now I think most of that has subsided and prices are still high and rising. And so that's causing a lot of people to kind of be very fearful, especially travelers, because, okay, now you have higher costs back home. You also have higher short-term costs on assignment for your housing. And, what are you going to do? And that leads a lot of people to ask the question, are pay rates going to keep up with the inflation? And that's a very good question.
Yeah, it's a very logical question, because if you see your costs going up, then you think, well, I'm going to need to make more as a travel therapist to offset those costs and make it worth it. And then logically you might think, well, maybe because it's affecting everyone, then all the travel jobs will start to pay a little bit more to make it more worth our while to come there. And that's definitely a logical thought process. So that's why we wanted to address it.
Now, the first thing to talk about here in terms of travel pay, a lot of people got into travel in the last 2 years. I would say probably half of our audience are new travelers in the last 2 years. And that's natural because travel turns over a lot. Most people don't travel for more than 1 or 2 years anyway. So most people that are following us, that are watching these videos, have just started traveling in the last 2 years. So a lot of times they don't know much about what travel pay was like before COVID. So it helps to give some insight into that. So basically, prior to COVID, pay rates were, we'll call that like the normal range. Like it stayed pretty consistent from 2015 or so when we started until late 2019. Pay rates were fairly consistent in the same range. And
and from what we know, even from like 2011 up until 2019, it was relatively consistent. I think there were some Medicare changes before 2010 that could have made that pay fluctuate and things. That we don't know that there were any major changes between roughly 2011 and 2019. So we'll call that kind of the normal.
And that also applies to permanent therapists. Usually pay rates don't fluctuate that much. Maybe just like a small cost of living increase, 2 or 3%. But there's not been any big jumps up or down in travel pay or permanent pay for probably about a decade before COVID. Things were pretty consistent. And then during COVID, the travel market got thrown into chaos, basically. Probably about 90% of people lost contracts or couldn't find jobs. The market dropped significantly. So we were seeing 90% less jobs during COVID. So between like March of 2020 to about September of 2020, a huge decrease in the number of jobs. And what happens when you have a decrease in the number of jobs and the same number of people looking for jobs is it pushes down pay rates. And that's exactly what we saw. So pay rates dropped somewhere between 10 to 20%, and in some cases even more than 10 to 20% on average between the end of 2019 and the beginning of, or I guess like the early to mid 2022.
And it's important to note that we're looking at averages here. Anybody who's done any research into travel therapy, you're going to know that pay rates are going to vary drastically between disciplines, a little bit between states, between settings, and then just it'll fluctuate randomly in different areas, kind of depending on like the supply and demand of that area. But when we were looking at your typical average pay packages for that middle to end of 2020 and even coming into 2021, we were seeing on average down 10 to 20%. Some contracts stayed roughly the same, like those contracts that were paying in the 15 to 1600 range probably stayed about the same, but we did see some contracts dip down into the $1,300 and $1,400 a week range, which we never really saw a lot of contracts that low. And this is after tax numbers for like PT/OT speech, obviously a bit lower for assistants. And for a while there, for a good 9 to 12 months after March 2020, it was extremely rare to see a contract paying more than $2,000 a week after tax. Whereas before COVID, in places like California and some other areas, it would be pretty typical to see some contracts, maybe, I don't know, roughly 10 to 20% of the total contracts that were open could be above that $2,000 range. But that was unheard of during COVID. The pay rates just plummeted due to caseloads going down and less need for therapists.
Yeah, and uncertainty, that was the big thing. Clinics didn't know what staffing they needed, and they were trying to make do with the lowest possible staffing. Because in hindsight, we know that it was about a 6-month period that lasted. But while it was going on, everyone was very pessimistic about the travel market. We had about probably 5 or 6 of our very good experienced recruiters leave travel altogether because they thought it was not going to rebound for years. And we know a lot of travelers that took perm jobs or just settled down, moved into other careers because the travel market was so bad. And so a lot of people left. No one knew that it was only going to last a relatively short period of time compared to what it could have been. It could have been years before things recovered.
Yep.
So now, knowing what we know, we were fairly lucky that it kind of started to pick back up at the end of 2020. Now, between the end of 2020 and going into 2021, pay rates recovered, and actually by probably mid-2021, so about a year ago, they actually surpassed pre-COVID levels. And going into the end of 2021, we saw pay rates probably somewhere between 5 or 10% higher than pre-COVID levels. So we had like this dip for COVID, and then it came all the way back up and it surpassed previous levels.
Yeah, so that's pay rates and demand. So we saw jobs, the number of open jobs increase significantly. And if you guys have followed our job market updates, you'll know that the number of open travel jobs for especially PT and SLP and somewhat OT has exceeded the demand than ever before. It used to be on average for PT, OT, SLP, you could see anywhere from like maybe 300 to 500 job openings. Now we're seeing upwards of 1,000 or more for PT and SLP especially. So the number of job openings in 2021 skyrocketed, as well as the pay. Now, a lot of the pay on average went back to about what we would consider like normal pre-COVID levels. You still see a ton of pay packages end of 2021 into now that were in that like $1,500 to $1,800 a week after tax range, which was about our average. But there are some, like a handful of jobs that were up to 20-25% higher pay, which was amazing. Like for the first time, we saw a lot more jobs. Still, these are only like the top few jobs out there, but they were 2,500, 3,000 plus a week, which we never would have seen before COVID.
Yeah.
But I would say on average, they were about this. They got back to the point where they were about the same, if not maybe 5 to 10% higher.
Yeah, so if you think about it that way, that high end went higher because demand suddenly shot up for therapists. So it went from, at one point there was less than 100 open PT jobs in the country to suddenly all-time highs within just a few months. There was 1,200, 1,300 open travel PT jobs, and that continues pretty much through today. So inflation has been, say, 8 to 10% over the last year or so, and travel pay is probably up about 8 to 10%. Which is interesting to think about because the two are not really correlated. So that was just that's just chance basically. But at this point, I would say travel pay has kept up with inflation up to this point, but I do not think that's going to continue long term. And that's where we have to get into what actually drives rates for travelers.
Yeah, and again, it's really important to note that that is on average. that we're saying inflation could be anywhere 8 to 10%, and on average, pay could be up 5 to 10%. But in some cases, pay is actually about the same, depending on your discipline, the state and city that you're looking at a job in, and the setting, whether it's a hospital, skilled nursing facility, so forth and so on. There are some jobs currently that certainly are not keeping up with inflation, that are just about the same as they were in 2019. And so some of you might be looking at it being like, well, I'm not seeing these high pay packages. It totally depends on where you're looking for jobs. So we're talking about averages. In some cases, some therapists are seeing their pay go down a little bit, and they're like, why is my pay going down a little bit? Like even on extensions, we've heard this. And so we're going to get into talking about what are these factors that are really driving the travel therapy pay more so than just strictly inflation. It would be nice if it was easy to just look at it and be like, oh, inflation's going up, pay's going up. But unfortunately, those two things are not really tied together.
Yeah, so what are the two things that most impact reimbursement rates? And this applies both to permanent therapists and travelers. The first one is supply and demand, and you can see this in permanent jobs all the time. So if you go to an area that has a bunch of PT schools nearby, pay rates are always lower. You see this around the country. If you go, a lot of people we talk to want to go to like Raleigh, North Carolina. There's a bunch of PT schools around there. We're really familiar with the area. Pay rates are very low, both for travelers and for permanent therapists. If you go to places where there's not many PT schools, the supply of therapists is less, which means the demand for therapists is higher. Pay rates are usually higher in those areas. So supply and demand is really important both for travelers and permanent therapists. And we saw this just like I was talking about with the paid dip and then coming back up. That's exactly what caused that, was a supply and demand imbalance. During COVID, you had a ton of people looking for jobs, not many jobs, so pay rates went up. After COVID, or I would say like near the tail end of 2021, we saw suddenly a huge demand for therapists because you had post-COVID patients, you had patients that had joint replacements and surgeries that they'd been putting off. So suddenly the demand for therapists went through the roof and the supply stayed the same. When the supply stays the same and demand increases, pay rates go up.
And supply could have even been down a little bit because we do know that there were some therapists that left healthcare during COVID, maybe retired early or switched careers. Or changed settings. So in some situations, there was actually less therapists available and more need for therapists. Especially we've seen that increase in like outpatient physical therapy and to an extent outpatient OT and speech, but definitely outpatient physical therapy because a lot of people got laid off during COVID at permanent jobs because there was no outpatient caseload. And that was kind of a trickle-down effect from hospitals shutting down elective surgeries to allow more beds for COVID patients, and that has a trickle-down effect to post-acute settings like inpatient rehab, skilled nursing, home health, as well as outpatient. So now, in some cases, from 2021 to 2022, we've seen an increased demand for therapists, way more job openings, not enough therapists to fill those jobs.
Yeah, so COVID, the fallout from COVID and the recovery is a clear indication of how supply and demand impacts both permanent therapists and travel therapists. We've seen pay rates fluctuate. That has nothing to do with inflation or the second factor that really impacts pay for therapists. So if you guys have any questions, leave those in the comments. If you have any comments about anything I'm talking about, if you think I'm wrong, or we don't know what we're talking about, feel free to let us know. We always want to have a discussion with you guys in these videos.
And we'd also love some feedback of what you guys are personally seeing in terms of supply and demand for the jobs you're looking for and pay rates. If you guys are getting some value and learning something out of this video, we would love if you would hit the thumbs up button. For those of you guys that are watching live, just let us know that you're learning something from the video.
All right, so that goes into the second major factor, and it's not inflation that impacts pay.
So the first one was
therapists.
supply and demand.
The second major factor is reimbursement rates. And for permanent therapists, this is very clear. For travelers, it should also be fairly clear, seeing how this would impact your pay. Because if a clinic cannot make money off of having you there, then they won't have you there. Either they need to basically they need to adjust your schedule so that you're able to generate more revenue for the clinic, or they need to decrease pay. And for travelers, there are times when there might be an actual imbalance there where a clinic could lose money on a traveler short term just for them to make it through until they hire a permanent person. So you sometimes get these crazy situations where a clinic is actually losing money, especially on a evaluating therapist, because they might have, let's say, 4 assistants and they don't have any evaluating therapists. They're willing to lose money on that therapist to have someone in there doing evals, discharges, because otherwise the clinic can't operate. But for the most part, if a clinic is not generating as much revenue as their expenses on a therapist, then they're going to either decrease their pay to the therapist, or figure out some other way to make it work, right? Or close. That's a worst case scenario. We've seen a lot of outpatient clinics that have gone under in the last couple of years because their expenses are higher than what the therapists are able to generate.
Now, obviously, this is going to vary. The amount that insurance reimbursement affects pay will vary based on the setting. This is certainly more of a factor in those settings where what you earn as a therapist is directly tied to how much revenue you can generate by billing units. So definitely outpatient, definitely skilled nursing, how much you're billing Medicare. Not as much hospital, because in hospitals sometimes have those bundled packages where they're getting paid the same for the patient regardless of how much therapy is involved, because it has to do with nursing and everything else for their stay. So it may not be as much of a driver for that setting, but definitely more for outpatient, for skilled nursing. What do you think about for home health? Do you think it would be as much of a driver?
Yeah, it is. It's less so than like outpatient or skilled nursing would be, where it's directly tied. It is still directly tied, but there's a lot more wiggle room with home health.
Because reimbursement rates tend to be higher for home health. And so Thomas asked, which PT settings are seeing increased pay and which are seeing decreased pay? It kind of really varies, I would say, on the location. Thomas, as far as the supply and demand, I don't know if it's as much the setting as it is the supply and demand for that. But you might also, as we mentioned there, if home health is still getting reimbursed really well, then you might still see pretty high. We usually tend to see the highest pay across all settings in home health because you get reimbursed really well for home health.
What we are seeing, though, is pay rates are definitely up for home health and outpatient recently. We've seen a lot higher paying contracts for home health and outpatient than pre-COVID. So, apparently...
I think the outpatient is more the supply and demand.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the reimbursement hasn't changed.
So that kind of goes into reimbursement rates. You would think maybe reimbursement rates go up with inflation. That has not been the case. Reimbursement rates, in fact, stay pretty stagnant for pretty much all of healthcare. And for therapists in particular, they've actually been declining over the last decade. So if reimbursement rates aren't going up, supply and demand stays constant, that puts a negative pressure on therapist pay, right? Both permanent therapists and travel therapists. Now, inflation doesn't really come into that at all, right? And in fact, I think that inflation is going to have a negative impact on pay rates, both for travelers and for permanent therapists. The reason for that being the clinic. So imagine you're a clinic owner. You don't get any more in reimbursement just because inflation's high, right? So your revenue stays pretty constant. At the same time, your costs are going up. So clinic owners see this just like we see it in terms of their rent for a building, their electricity prices, all the supplies that you order, and also how much it costs for you to hire support staff. So front desk workers, techs, all their pay has been going up as well. So if you're a clinic owner, your costs are going up, reimbursements staying the same. So you either have to figure out another way to cut costs, or you have to reduce therapist pay, which is essentially cutting costs as well. So I think that inflation is going to actually have a negative, a detrimental impact on pay rates more than it's going to have a positive impact, unfortunately.
And again, in that example, I think that especially applies to outpatient clinics when, again, it's like looking at a single, clinic owner, that sort of thing. It may not have as big of an impact on facilities that are receiving other forms of funding and have more money to spread around, like hospitals and skilled nursing, but it'll definitely affect them some. Another thing, in addition to the negative impact of inflation across all facilities and their costs, would be the fact that there's not as much like COVID relief pay or government assistance out there now. So we're seeing rising inflation at the same time that government assistance is going down, because for a while there, a lot of those crisis rates and higher pay that we were seeing, especially for like hospitals and nursing homes, they were getting COVID relief pay to pay for these patients. And that was a big reason why they were able to pay more. But now it's back to normal. A lot of that government funding is gone, so they don't have as much money to spread around for pay packages.
Yeah, and this is not just for therapists. We always think of I think a lot of these groups, you just focus only on therapists, and there's a lot of talk just about therapist pay and reimbursement and how much it impacts us, but it impacts all of healthcare. Nursing has seen the same thing. So nursing during those crisis rate times when there's a ton of government funding for COVID patients, you saw nursing rates through the roof for travelers. The demand was extremely high. Now that has died down a ton. Same thing for respiratory therapists. Yeah. Their pay rates there were some that were $6,000 to $10,000 a week for travel pay. All those are pretty much coming back to baseline. So this impacts everyone. It's not just a PT, OT, SLP, PTA, CODA thing. It's really all of healthcare. So basically we're stuck in healthcare between declining reimbursement rates, or at best stagnant reimbursement rates, combined with increased costs. And that means downward pressure on all of healthcare worker pay. So it's not a good environment to be in.
And so another thing to bring up here, I think when travelers look at, well, wouldn't inflation increase our pay because we have higher costs? When we look at the factors that we talked about so far, we don't see a place where inflation would have any impact on our pay, except only in the negative. Like, it doesn't affect the supply and demand. That's still going to be a major factor. It doesn't affect the reimbursement rate. We're still getting about the same reimbursement rate from insurances. We're not getting that COVID relief fund. We're not getting all that. In addition to that, something that they might think about is, well, some of our pay is stipends, right? And so some of our pay is actually tied to how much you can pay in the area for what's the average housing, the average mileage reimbursement, what the government allows for that, as well as meals and incidentals. So yes, part of our pay as travelers are those per diems, or those stipends, which is set based on a government entity called the GSA. So you can look it up on their GSA website for which city and state and how much you're allowed to reimburse for housing, meals, incidentals, and then there's a separate one for mileage reimbursement for those of us that do like home health and get paid for your mileage. So you might think, okay, well, if inflation's going up, then the government would raise the GSA. Unfortunately, in speaking to some company owners, it has not they have not increased the GSA or the mileage very much, if at all, this year in response to inflation. If anything, maybe just an extremely small percent. So that's one factor, is that hasn't caught up yet.
Yeah, it's correlated but not directly tied. So it does increase over time, but the increase is probably more on the order of like 1% a year, whereas inflation over the last decade, now with these high numbers, has probably averaged more in the 4 to 5% range. So over time, it gets less and less correlated to the actual cost of the area, unless they suddenly just have a big jump in how much they're willing to allocate for meals, incidentals, and housing for a location.
Which sometimes they do seasonally. Like, for example, a place that's really in demand in the winter is like Aspen, Colorado. So seasonally, they actually have higher GSA rates in that area because of the increased demand for housing and things. And they know that housing costs and things go up in the winter because that's their big season there. And the GSA rates are actually lower in the summer to take a contract there. So with that said, it has not jumped up that much with inflation, is the first factor. The second factor is sometimes, the next layer is, there's sometimes that companies are slow to change their policies, even if the government has changed something. For example, the mileage rate. Sometimes a company will have a policy that's like, we pay you 49 cents per mile for gas. And even though, yesterday the government was like, nope, we're going to increase it to, I think they increased it to like 53 cents or something, a little bit higher. Maybe the company still hasn't changed their policy and they're not increasing it.
Yeah, this is the facility, not the travel company.
Yep,
the reimbursement for things like that, for mileage, comes from the facility. So whatever their policy is also what the travel company will pay you.
Yep. Now the third thing to consider here is the pay package itself and where the money comes from. So the money for a pay package, hopefully you guys are familiar with this. If you're not, we have more detailed videos and more detailed articles that explain where the money comes from to get paid as a traveler. But basically it comes from what's called the bill rate. The bill rate is how much the facility pays the travel company in order to pay you. And so it might be something like $75 an hour, $80 an hour that the facility pays, and then they pay the travel company and the travel company pays you. Now, when it comes to the GSA rates, that determines the maximum allowed amount that the travel company is allowed to pay you if there's enough money in the bill rate to go around. So we will get questions from people a lot of times where they learn a little bit about the GSA and they'll go look at the GSA website and be like, well, they're not maxing out my per diems. They could be maxing it out and then I could make more money. But when you're building a pay package, you have to go off the total amount in the pot, which comes from the bill rate. If there's not a total amount in the pot from the bill rate to go around, that's enough to go around, then they cannot max out the per diems.
Yeah. A good example of this is, pretty much for travel companies, you always probably need to start with the taxable rate, whatever the traveler's comfortable with, as well as the travel company, what taxable hourly rate they're comfortable with. Usually that's somewhere in the $20 to $25 an hour range. Some people go less, some people go more, but that is the first factor to consider. After you have the taxable rate, then the rest of the money that comes from the pay package, the bill rate that the facility's paying the travel company, after they keep, whatever they need to keep for your benefits, for their profit, for paying their employees, all of that stuff, whatever's left after the taxable rate goes to those stipends. If there's not enough left for the stipends to max out the GSA max for that area, then you can't max it out, right? There's just not enough money there. So recently got a question from someone that didn't really understand this well, and she had gone to the GSA website and multiplied it, the daily rate by 7, and said like, oh, my company's not paying me enough. I think they're taking advantage of me. It's not they're taking advantage of you. It's just that the pay rate offered by the facility is not high enough to max out those stipends while still giving you a reasonable taxable pay, which is important. And in the eyes of the IRS, you need a reasonable taxable rate in addition to those stipends.
Yep. So if everything that we just said sounds like a foreign language to you, and you don't have the basic understanding of the way the pay packages work and all that, you'll definitely want to go after this video and do some further reading on our articles and listen to our videos where we explain the breakdown of how a pay package works between the hourly and the stipend and where the money comes from. But for those of you that are familiar with GSAs, when you're looking at inflation, you're thinking, well, if inflation is going up, my housing rate and my stipend should go up, and so therefore I should get paid more. Maybe, but you always have to consider the bill rate. So you have to consider if the facility is only offering a certain amount for the bill rate due to those other factors, due to the supply and demand for that job. Let's give an example. Let's say you're looking at an outpatient job in San Diego. If there's a lot of demand for the outpatient job in San Diego, then the facility can probably get by with paying less, and they will, because if it's an outpatient clinic and they're like, if I can pay somebody $1,600 a week, or whatever the bill rate is for $1,600 a week, let's say it's $70 an hour, and I can still get 20 people applying for the job, I will. And that'll help keep their costs down. In addition, if they're saying, well, my reimbursement from, Blue Cross Blue Shield and Medicare is still only this, so I'm not going to increase it. So if their reimbursement rate hasn't gone up and their supply and demand is such that they can afford to offer a pay package of only $1,600 a week, well, that is not going to allow your travel company any wiggle room to max out your stipends. I mean, I'm sure the stipends and the GSA allowable per diems for San Diego are through the roof. But if they're only working with a $70 bill rate because of the supply and demand, they can't max out your stipends. So yes, cost of living in San Diego might have gone up, and who knows, maybe the GSA went up a little bit too, but you may not be anywhere close to maxing out and being able to optimize those GSA rates if the bill rate doesn't support it. So it really comes back on the facility and what the facility is paying.
Yeah, so we hate to be pessimistic. I wrote an article that went out today that has a little more detail on this if you guys want to read that article as well. We like to do articles and videos together, and I was thinking through all this, and we got a lot of questions about whether pay rates were going to increase. In reality, I don't think that travel pay rates are going to increase, and I don't think permanent pay rates are going to increase substantially, because in reality, I think supply and demand really is at all-time highs in favor of therapists right now. So there's not much higher to go. I don't think there's going to be a sudden catalyst for a lot more demand for therapists after COVID starts to die down. There's less post-COVID patients. All of the backlog in elective surgeries is completely worked through, and I don't see reimbursement rates increasing unless there's some major push or lobbying effort to increase reimbursement rates. They're just staying stagnant or decreasing. So if you take those two main factors, it's really hard to see a situation where pay rates actually increase with inflation from this point going forward. We don't want to be pessimistic, but we do want to be realistic with you guys, because there's a lot of people considering whether to get into travel therapy or not, leaving a permanent job, and that's a big decision.
Yep.
So we don't want to just pretend like, oh, it's going to be great, it's going to keep going up, when we don't think that's the case.
Yep. So with that said, just to summarize, no, we don't think that pay is going to go up, in accordance with inflation, but we do think that pay is already up because of other factors. So in a lot of cases, you can still make a lot more money right now as a travel therapist than you could have made before COVID. And in most cases, I would say on average, you can make about the same, which still makes it very much worth it. Now, of course, your costs could be higher in some cases. However, we still think it's really financially worth it for most people if you can do your best to keep your fixed costs at home somewhat low, as well as look at the cost of living at the area that you're going and try to keep your costs low for your housing and things like that for where you're going for a travel assignment. In most cases, travel therapists are still making 1.5 to 2 times what they would make at a permanent job. So we still absolutely think it's worth it financially, much less, of course, still worth it for the other perks of travel, like getting to see different parts of the country, getting to try out different settings, getting the flexibility to have more time off in your schedule. We still think there's a ton of benefits to being a travel therapist, and we also still think a lot of you guys are going to make really good money and come out ahead. But with rising inflation, you are going to have to be a little more cognizant of your costs and try to make it more financially lucrative for yourself by adjusting your costs and adjusting which jobs that you're accepting and making sure that it makes sense for you.
If you're considering travel, the comparison needs to be between what you could make on travel contracts versus what you would make in your area at a permanent job. That should always be the calculation that you're looking at to see if it's worth it for you. And there are some areas of the country where it might not be worth it. If you're in a really great paying area, I think Nevada is usually a really good paying area for therapists. Maybe you have a permanent job there paying $110,000 a year. You're not going to make a significant amount more than that as a traveler.
And when you say make, we mean keep. You want to look at how much you're keeping after your costs, because you might be looking at a travel job that is double of what you're making, but if you know that you have a really high mortgage rate and you have a lot of really expensive fixed costs on a month-to-month basis at home, and then also you're looking at a $2,500 a week job in San Francisco where your costs are also going to be high, you have to look at the net pay that you're going to keep after taking into account your costs.
Yeah. Meanwhile, if you're looking at jobs in North Carolina, where, like we were talking about, is very competitive around the Raleigh area. If you were going to either work there or travel and you're looking at perm jobs there, a lot of perm jobs there are only paying $60,000 to $62,000. We're seeing a lot of people taking jobs in that area there because the supply of therapists is high and the demand is not very high. So if you're comparing that to travel, then yeah, travel, you're probably going to come out way ahead. So you just have to look at it that way. And all the factors that we talked about apply to both travelers and permanent therapists. So this is downward pressure across the board, which means relatively travel is still attractive. So you just have to consider your own individual situation, realize that just because travel pay might start to decrease in the future, you have to compare that to permanent pay, not what it used to be for travelers, because this is kind of a weird environment that we've been in where jobs are just way more available jobs for therapists than they've ever been before. So you can't expect this to go on forever. We don't really expect it to go on forever. We hope it lasts as long as possible, but we have to be realistic.
Yep. So the bottom line is, even if pay decreases slightly from where it is right now, that's just kind of like coming back to the averages that we saw for a decade before COVID, with the environment of maybe just slightly higher cost areas or slightly higher costs in some areas. Now, we did a video a couple months ago. I think it could have even been like January, February, right before we left for this No, maybe it was like March,
Talking about
April.
whether it was worth it?
Whether it was worth it. So
it was probably like a year ago, I think.
No, I think it was right before we left for Alaska.
Okay.
Or either right before we left I can't remember. It was a few months ago. I'll go back and find it once we get done with this video and link to it in the comments. But that would be a really good video for you guys to watch, where we specifically talked about, like, at that time we were starting to see housing costs rise a little bit. And we were getting that question a lot of, is it still worth it? And we went into a lot of detail where you guys just need to compare your costs at home and your cost of living at your travel assignment. And there are various ways you can try to decrease your costs to make it still worthwhile on the expense side of things, and then also different ways on the income side of things. It's really important, in our opinion, to consider that it's not always just the highest paying job is the best job for you to take, because if the cost of living is also really high there, you're not going to come out that much ahead. A lot of times we came out really ahead financially by taking moderately paying jobs in lower cost of living areas, like more rural areas or more suburban areas. Again, it's just going to fluctuate and vary depending on the housing availability and the different area of the country and how much you're having to drive and use gas and that sort of thing. But in our experience, when we were working full-time between the years of 2015 to 2018, we were taking contracts anywhere from $1,500 to about $1,850 a week. So we never made more than, I think our highest was like $1,850 or $1,875.
Yeah, our average was about $1,680. I calculated it.
Yeah, so we made an average of only $1,680 a week after taxes. There are certain travel therapists out there right now that have been used to these really high pay packages the last couple of years, and they think $1,600, I'm never going to take a job that is that low. We reached financial independence after only a couple of years taking contracts that were $1,650 on average, and we had really low fixed costs at home and really low cost of living areas. So our expenses were very low and we were able to make really good money.
It was more than a couple years, but we did save a ton of money by doing it that way, taking relatively low pay packages to what some people might take, like in California, but our cost of living was much lower.
Yeah.
So you always have to consider those things. That's a very important factor. How much is the cost of living in the area versus how much is the pay package? Because there's a lot of places where taking a $1,700 pay package, if cost of living is low, you'll save a lot more than you would making $2,200 if cost of living is high.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about what you guys can do in terms of considering the expenses and your costs. Now, we always get the question of how can I negotiate more pay? Because of course, if you can increase the amount that you're making, that's really important too. So of course, you can just look for the jobs that are already advertised that are very high. And if you happen to see some really high paying ones that significantly offset the cost of living in that area, then boom, apply for that one. But sometimes competition can be really high. If you see like a $2,700 a week pay package, there's going to be a lot of applicants, so take that into consideration. Now, when it comes to negotiating, again, there's a lot of factors that go into negotiating. Are you very experienced? Do you have a lot of leverage in the situation? If it's a rural job that doesn't have a lot of applicants, they might increase the bill rate. You can work with your recruiter and say, I'm really experienced, I'm going to hit the ground running. You're not going to have to do much training with me. I've worked in this setting for many years. There's a lot of reasons why they might really want you there, and they might increase that bill rate. Or also supply and demand, like if they're desperate and they don't have any other applicants and you're saying, I can start as soon as possible, I already have the license. These are all things that leverage you to be able to earn more on a contract. Now, on the flip side, unfortunately, if it's one of those really competitive jobs, like that outpatient job in San Diego, and they have 50 applicants, you may not be able to negotiate as much there and leverage those skills and availability that you have just because they have so many other applicants.
Yeah, we made a video about negotiating and wrote an article about it as well. We wish that there was some secret to it, and people often try to sell other people on secrets to negotiating. There's no secret. It's situationally dependent. If you're in a situation where you have the upper hand, say they don't have a lot of applicants, or you're the best applicant, then you have a lot of negotiating power. If you're in a situation where, say, you don't have much experience, there's a bunch of other applicants that do have experience, you don't have much negotiating power. If you have other options, you have negotiating power. If you don't have other options and you're stuck with just that one, you don't have as much negotiating power. So every situation is different.
Yeah, how much you're willing to walk away from a job is really important too, because if you push too hard on negotiation, there's always a chance they're just going to say, no, we're going to go with another applicant. But if you know that you're very marketable and you're open to at least a couple different settings, a couple different states, you got a couple licenses, and you have your pick of the litter of a bunch of jobs, if you don't like this one, you can pass on it and go for one that pays a little bit higher. But if you're somebody who only wants to be in one particular state or one particular city and you only want one setting, that's going to reduce your pool of options, so you don't have as much negotiating power to walk away from contracts and wait for something better to come along if you're narrowing down your search.
Yeah, so I saw some questions and comments coming through. We're going to go through those in just a minute. If you have any questions or comments, leave those in the chat right now. We want to leave you with what we think is the most important things that therapists can do to increase payment, or what our pay packages are, both for permanent and travel therapists. But if you guys have any questions, comments, we always appreciate that. If you could like this video, that really helps us out as well.
Yep, thank you. If you guys don't mind just pressing the thumbs up button. If you have a friend that needs to hear about this or learn about it, you can tag them in the comments or share it with them as well. We would really appreciate that.
So for long term, the ultimate thing that impacts the pay that we make as therapists is reimbursement rates. If they stay stagnant or they're declining, our pay is going to be following suit. What we have to do is lobby for higher reimbursement rates, right? That can take a lot of different forms, supporting the APTA if they are making efforts to try to increase reimbursement rates.
AOTA and ASHA as well.
Exactly, or at least trying to limit the cuts in reimbursement rates, because that's what's a killer. If reimbursement rates are dropping 10% and inflation is up 10%, that's awful for us as therapists. So lobbying is very important. Another thing you can consider is going some sort of cash pay route. I know a lot of therapists are doing that these days, because then your pay is not based on what reimbursement insurance will pay you. It's based on what you can negotiate with your actual client or patient. So that way you have a lot more power in what you actually make. If you can sell yourself, you're a very good therapist, you can get people better, word of mouth spreads, you can make an unlimited amount of money. I mean, there are personal trainers that make hundreds of dollars an hour just because they market themselves well. It doesn't mean their education level is obviously lower than ours as therapists. it's not always directly tied to your education level or whatever. It's how you can sell yourself. And that's where something like cash pay really comes into play.
Yeah.
So
some people also leverage their skills to pick up some kind of side income by using your background as a therapist, whether it's like doing some kind of health and wellness online program in addition to having your 9 to 5, more permanent job, or even travel therapy 40-hour-a-week job. You may also start some kind of online business where you're having clients in that manner. There are other ways that you can leverage your skills to increase your pay outside of just the typical reimbursement-based therapy jobs. But in terms of those hospitals and clinics and things that you're an employee and you're working based on how much they're reimbursed, you really are tied to that. So we need to be lobbying our governing bodies, Medicare, Medicaid. The CMS is the organization that controls those, to try to advocate for the services that we're providing and that there's value to those services and that they shouldn't cut the pay that they're paying to reimburse, because people need therapy. They need PTs, they need OT, they need speech language pathology. So we need to try to keep those rates up instead of seeing them decline like we have been.
Ultimately, what we can make as therapists is tied to the revenue we can generate with the units we bill. So basically there's 2 inputs there, right? If you bill more units or you get reimbursed more per unit, then you can generate more revenue for the clinic, meaning that you can make more as a therapist. I don't think many therapists want to bill more units, see more patients, but that's always an option too. If you're working at a clinic that is seeing one-on-one for an hour, maybe you can see more patients, bill more units. That could increase your reimbursement or your total reimbursement or revenue generated. There's a lot of people that are seeing already an absurd number of patients and don't want to do that, and that's definitely understandable. So then if that is not a variable that can be adjusted, the only other one is reimbursement per unit, which is what we need to push to have increased.
In the long term, yep. Absolutely. Well, we hope that those give you some actionable tips for what you guys can do in the long term. But then right now, obviously in the short term, like we talked about, you need to just always be considering your personal situation. Look at where you can reduce costs. Look at where you can increase pay by the jobs that you're applying for, how you are negotiating for those jobs, the flexibility to go to different places. If finances are your primary objective, then you want to work closely with your recruiters to let them know that, so that they can help you to apply to those really high paying jobs, or they can help you to identify places that you'll make more bang for your buck at the end of the day because the cost of living is lower and the pay package is moderate to high. So those are the places you can really make a big impact on your pay. But again, I think there's just a lot of therapists out there who they go into travel therapy, they want to make more, but they also want to have a good quality of life. And they maybe have certain areas that are on their bucket list that they really want to go to. And so if that's the case, if you're really dead set on going to a certain place, then you'll just be at the mercy of what is available in that area. And you can try to use some of these strategies to still make sure you're coming out ahead financially, but also don't discount the experiences that you're having, the opportunities that you're having to travel the country, take time off, work in different settings, meet new coworkers, meet new friends. Don't discount those benefits of travel therapy as well.
Yep. We've learned that a lot with this Alaska contract. It's been really amazing. We've been very busy doing things that we would have never been able to do otherwise. So that's definitely a big perk of travel as well.
Yep.
All right, so going through some comments, we're going to start at the top.
I already commented on, I think, a lot of these, but we did have some questions that came in. Thank you guys for introducing yourself. I appreciate that. Joel says that he read our article on inflation. Great read. I would highly recommend that anybody that's watching this video or listening on the podcast also go and read the article that accompanies this video, because it breaks down everything we talked about in a very organized manner. Talks about a lot of the same factors that we discussed.
Yeah, we're not putting out as much content as we used to, but I really, articles that I write, I try to make them quality articles and put a lot of time and effort into those. So hopefully that's helpful.
All right, let's see what else you guys had to say. Melissa said crazy amount here in Florida. I believe that was talking about the housing prices.
Yeah, housing prices.
Yeah, housing prices are nuts right now.
I think most people feel that way. I think Florida and Texas seem to have the quickest rises based on what I've seen. But I think all around the country, people are seeing quick jumps in housing prices.
So Joel has been working home health in California, and he said his weekly gross is about $3,000. And I think at one point, Joel was actually netting over $3,000, but I do believe that Joel, as well as a couple of other therapists we saw that had originally signed on maybe 6 or 9 months ago at some of these higher crisis rates, they were actually seeing some of their rates drop, unfortunately, on extension. Still really good pay, still in like the 2,000s after taxes, but we're not seeing as many of those 3,000 plus anymore because of these supply and demand factors and lack of COVID reimbursement from the government. So, but even if you are, like, again, you have to look at the big picture. Even if you're seeing that pay rate go slightly down from 3,000 to in the 2,000s, still really good pay.
Yep.
Okay, let's see here. We talked about that. Renee said, doesn't skilled nursing have the bundle payments too with the new PDPM rules? This is when we were talking about the way that we get paid as therapists. We have not worked in skilled nursing for a while, so I know that we did do some research on PDPM when it first rolled out, but I can't remember exactly how it works, but you might be correct in that.
Yeah, I think it depends on the insurance. I don't think all of them do, at least as of a couple years ago, but I'm not 100% sure about all the different insurances and how they actually reimburse skilled nursing facilities.
But I think she's right. I think that one of the big take-homes of the PDPM changes is that our pay wasn't as tied to the number of minutes that we were billing anymore. So in that case, then the number of minutes or units that you're billing in skilled nursing isn't tied as much to your pay. It's probably going to be more supply and demand. Okay, Allie says, I'm at a trauma to acute care hospital in Texas between Fort Worth and Dallas. They have a significant shortage of therapists, and they asked me to extend. However, they turned around and offered me a reduction in pay. It was already on the low side, but I was choosing acute care over the higher paying settings. So I'm definitely not going to extend because they offered a lower rate.
Yeah, we definitely don't blame you for that. And in a situation like that, a lot of times you're just choosing whether you want to extend based on what other options are available at the time. If there's another job that pays higher that fits you well, definitely don't extend that job. But a lot of times when, like especially a hospital facility, they'll just have something from up high that says, we're reducing all bill rates $5 for therapists, nurses, everyone at this facility. And there's not much budge there, even if they are desperate, because this is a decision made by someone that doesn't really know the dynamics of supply and demand. So in some of those really big bureaucratic type organizations, it's not always quickly seen in the pay packages in terms of how desperate they are and how high they'll pay.
So in Allie's situation, I know because Allie's followed us for a long time, she's a very experienced clinician with, I want to say, 15 to 20 years of experience. So she very likely has a lot of options. She has more than one state license. She has experience in more than one setting. So in Allie's situation, it makes a lot of sense. Like, why am I going to take a pay cut? I've got plenty of other options.
Exactly.
Now, if for some reason in Allie's situation, if she wanted to stay in that job because it just was convenient for her with her housing or being near family or whatever her reason was, she would also be in a good position to try to push and negotiate and be like, you know, it seems like you really need me here, right? Like, it seems like you guys are really hurting for therapists right now. I'm already trained. I'm already here. I can just continue my contract, but I'm going to put my foot down and say, I will not extend my contract unless you keep my pay rate the same or raise it. You're in a really good position to negotiate at that point. And a lot of times if you push, they'll come back and say, you know what, I asked the powers that be, and you know what, we actually can pay you the same or more. But they might also just come back and say, I'm sorry, they're reducing our rates, I can't. And so then Allie would just have to be willing to walk away at that point and be like, it's fine, I've got other options.
Yeah, if you're willing to walk away, you have other options. That's when you have all the cards in your hand, basically. And you can make demands, and if they're not met, then just take another option. And that's the best position to be in terms of negotiating. Mm-hmm. So Thomas says, in response to Allie, my acute care contract wanted to reduce my pay with the extension. I started a few weeks ago. My recruiter and account manager had my back and was able to keep my pay the same, which was very helpful and won me over with them for having my back. Yeah, that's great. And it's probably one of those situations too where they said, you know, this is a very good candidate. If you don't pay them what they deserve, then they're going to leave. And then the hospital, you know, they lose money when they have to train new therapists because productivity is less. So they don't want to do that. And a lot of times it makes sense for them to pay a little bit more. It just depends on the specific hospital, how high those decisions have to be made. It's going to vary a lot, but that's good you were able to do that.
That's great. And Thomas also said, thank you for this very informative information. You're welcome, Thomas. We really try to address current issues that are going on, especially ones that we get a lot of questions about. And I know we're a few weeks late on this in terms of like when a lot of this inflation stuff started to roll out. We try to do our best to gather a lot of information and have a really good amount of data to present to you. I think we were on the phone with like 45 minutes with one of the company directors the other day, just learning more about what they were seeing, getting some stats, and coming up with some good information to bring you guys. So hopefully it's been helpful.
Yeah, and it really stinks that a lot of our content recently has been relatively negative. but I feel like we are in a position where we have to present the most accurate information. And I feel like a lot of times information you get in groups is skewed towards the positive for travel. And we don't want someone to make an uninformed decision and jump into travel and then regret the decision. So, there are a lot of positives, but there also are a lot of negatives. And we never want to be the ones giving people false hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think our underlying message is that travel therapy is still wonderful. We absolutely highly encourage you to consider travel if it's feasible for you, to remain a traveler if it's feasible for you, to start traveling if it is. But we always want you guys to be well informed and know what factors are at play so that you can make the best decision for your career. In a lot of cases, not just your career, but your family, depending on if you have a spouse or family to consider too.
Lauren says, my acute care contract just offered me an extension with a small raise of $150 per week. I'm trying to counter for a larger raise, but it sounds like maybe I'm in the minority and should take while I can. Always try to get higher. I would never say there's a situation where you shouldn't at least counteroffer, because especially on an extension, the worst they'll usually say is, no, we can't do that, in which case you're in the same position. So always at least try to counter for a little higher. If they can, they will. If they won't, then you're not any worse off.
Yeah, and then you're just in a situation where you say, is it worth it to me to extend this contract for $150 more a week? Do I like the situation I'm in? And at least I tried, and that's the best I could get. Or are you just ready to be done with it and you have better options out there? Then you're just in that situation to take it into consideration. Allie says that regarding her situation, the hospital has massively dropped the bill rate and there's no way that my company can pay the massive difference on the extension. I'm on the original rate until the end of my contract in 3 weeks, but it's not my travel company's fault. They have my back through several challenges and over several years. Yeah. Absolutely, Allie. I think that's really important that you have so much experience to understand the factors that are at play here, and that it's really truly coming down from the hospital reducing the rate, which we've heard across the board in a lot of different states. Hospitals are reducing rates. So then you just have to know that you've done everything you can. Your travel company has done everything that you can. It could be that maybe your travel company could just go back one more time and ask, like the hospital, if they would consider keeping the rate the same. But if they won't, then they just won't. And with a huge hospital system, you sometimes don't have that wiggle room.
Yeah, having that perspective as an experienced traveler is important, because we see a lot of new travelers that don't really understand that often the travel company is just stuck in the middle. They want to pay you as much as they possibly can, but if the bill rate's reduced, there's only so much they can do.
Mm-hmm. Joel said in regards to negotiating for contracts, he says that experience in multiple settings and having experience with multiple EMRs counts a lot. We agree with that. So when you guys are in your contract negotiations, if you have experience in different settings and you can market yourself saying, I'm ready to roll with this electronic medical record keeping system, that will help, because they know that you're going to be more productive right away rather than having like a slower ramp up time. But again, it always sometimes does come back to the supply and demand. You might be the best candidate with 20 years of experience in multiple settings, multiple EMRs, but if there's just a lot of applicants, they may not care as much as if it was a permanent job. If it's a permanent job, those things count a heck of a lot more than if it's a travel job. Because permanent jobs, they're like, I want the best clinician I could possibly have because we're gonna have you for the long run. Travel jobs, sometimes they just need somebody that's good enough to fill the void for a little while. So if the really experienced therapist is asking for way more money, they might be like, yeah, we can get by with like the mediocre therapist for 13 weeks. But it just depends. Every hiring manager and director is gonna be different in what they're looking for.
Yep, Nick's tuning in. Thanks for tuning in, Nick. How's your contract going? Are you still staying in Texas, or are they extending you at the same rate they were? I remember it was a pretty high paying job. Christine said, this is helpful. I'm an SLP looking into travel pay for the first time. Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions from new travelers and in groups where people don't really understand all the factors at play. And that's what we think we can provide in terms of making these more long form videos and articles. There's no way you can convey all this information in like a short Facebook post or something like that. So we try to use this platform to talk through all of the ins and outs of things like pay and what goes into it, and hopefully that makes everyone a little more informed, and we can all improve that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, once the video is done, I will link to some additional resources that I think will be helpful for you guys in the comments, so you guys can read through more of that and learn more regarding negotiating pay, rising housing costs and that sort of thing.
Nick says his house appreciated $60,000 in 9 months in Texas. That's pretty awesome.
Sweet. Well,
that's awesome for you. It's not awesome for other people that are in the housing market.
Alrighty. Okay. Lauren has a question. Lauren says, for those of you that have extended at an assignment, have you been able to get a raise with both extensions? I just extended and my boss is already asking me to extend again, but I don't want to sound too greedy by asking for another raise on my second extension. So if anybody has any feedback for Lauren, you can reply to her comment. I don't know if we've...
My feedback would always be that it depends. If you've already been there 6 months, by the time your second contract ends, you're a very valuable asset to that company. Because at that point, you're very productive, you're very familiar with the clinic, you have rapport with patients, you're going to be more valuable to that clinic than a new traveler would be. So you can often leverage that to make a little bit more. That might come in the form of the facility raising their bill rate instead of what normally the second contract or the first extension is that the travel company is taking a slightly lower margin because they don't have as much upfront costs on that second contract. So you can always try. It always depends. It's very, again, situationally dependent, just like negotiating would be, but it's always worth trying. If you already have 6 months there, then chances are they like you, they want to keep you there, and they might pay you a little bit more.
Yep, definitely worth asking, but as with any negotiation, you just have to know, feel out what you feel is an appropriate amount to ask for and not be too pushy if you don't want to lose it. If you have a really good rapport with everybody there and it's a good situation for you to stay longer, then you don't want to push too much and then have them be like, whoa, this person, they're asking way too much, maybe we just won't extend them at all. But if you don't really care, if you could kind of take it or leave it, then you could push harder and just be like, either they'll give me this or they won't, and I'll leave. But just kind of find that fine line on how much you feel is appropriate to ask for.
Yep. Nick says he'll be there until January, staying a full year, and that his pay rate was lowered slightly, but not much. So still sounds like a really good contract you had there.
Yeah, Nick had an outpatient contract. I believe it was one-on-one in Texas that was paying an absurd amount, $2,600 a week or something. So again, kind of like supply and demand. If they saw a big demand in the beginning, or maybe they had some kind of government reimbursement or whatever it was, they were offering this huge rate and now they're lowering it a little bit. Well, in Nick's situation, he still felt it was good to extend, even though it was slightly lower than this absurd rate that no one's ever seen for outpatient in Texas before, $2,600. I would have been the same. We would have been like, yeah, we'll ride this $2,600 gravy train as long as it lasts. But even if on the extension they're only going to offer us $2,000 a week, that would still be significantly more than we ever would have expected. So we would have extended in that case too.
Yeah, everything in travel is relative. Based on what you can make at the time, what you've made before, how much you can ask for extensions, what options you have. So every situation is different, and that's why it's important to be as informed as possible.
Yep. So we hope this has been informational and educational for you guys. We hope it helps you better understand the current job environment, what factors are coming into play when it comes to travel therapist pay packages. We always want you guys to be really informed when you're going into your job search and your negotiations. Again, if this was helpful for you, we would just really appreciate it if you could give us a thumbs up on the video, leave us a comment, say thank you, share it with a friend who might need to hear it. And if you're really feeling like you just love us and we're the greatest, you could leave us a review on our Facebook page or on our podcast. We would really appreciate that.
Yep. Thanks for all the support, guys. We'll see you hopefully in another week or two with some more content.
Awesome. And keep up with us on Facebook and Instagram if you want to see our Alaska travel therapy pictures. We've been doing some amazing stuff. We went fishing the other day and Jared caught a huge salmon, which we're going to cook for dinner tonight. We've been doing some epic hikes, prettier than any of the stuff not any of the stuff, but a lot of the stuff we've seen in the lower 48. We've got some national park trips coming up soon, some camping. So it's been a really cool contract. And if you want to see the pictures, check us out on Instagram or Facebook.
Yep. Take care.
Bye, guys.